Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today's September 16th, 2025, and we're tackling something pretty unique.
Definitely a different angle today.
Yeah, it's an eschatological analysis, basically, end-time stuff, looking at 7 specific Bible verses.
Right, interpreted through a very particular prophetic framework.
And here's the twist. The source then speculatively connects this interpretation to hypothetical world events from today.
Hypothetical being the key word there.
Absolutely. Our goal isn't to say this is happening, but to explore how this analysis connects ancient texts to imagine modern news. We're unpacking the method, the interpretation.
Understanding the analytical journey itself.
Exactly. Okay, so let's dig in. Where does this analysis start?
Well, the source begins by looking closely at 7 biblical verses. Some examples are 1 Kings 18.21, Nehemiah 9.37.
John 16.37, Matthew 5.44. These kinds of passages.
Precisely. And though they seem quite different on the surface, the source weaves them into what it calls a coherent prophetic narrative.
A narrative, like a story.
Sort of. It describes a covenant community, a specific group in crisis. It maps a progression, starting with what's termed a crisis of allegiance.
Like that line from 1 Kings, halting between two opinions, that kind of indecision.
Exactly, that kind of fundamental spiritual choice. And the narrative suggests this leads through internal problems, corruption towards external pressure.
Subjugation, distress.
Yes. And then it concludes with how the divine is expected to respond within that narrative.
Okay, that's the base narrative. But then, as you mentioned, a specific scholar's framework comes in, Dr. Ernest L. Martin, pre-1998 work.
Correct. And applying Martin's lens really sharpens the focus towards a distinct end-time reading.
How so? How does it reinterpret that crisis?
Well, Martin's framework reframes that crisis of allegiance. It's not just general indecision anymore. It becomes the ultimate choice. The true Christ versus a deceptive figure, a man of sin.
The false Messiah figure.
Right. And that subjugation and distress, like in Nehemiah 9.37 about historical oppression, that gets identified specifically as the suffering of the faithful under a literal end-time Babylon the Great.
Which is envisioned as, what, a global system?
A global political and economic system, yeah. One that's seen as oppressive. But there's also a promise highlighted.
Okay.
John 16.13, the Spirit of Truth, is interpreted as ensuring prophetic clarity for believers to understand these coming things.
And Matthew 5.44, love your enemies.
That becomes the prescribed spiritual stance, the ethical response for this remnant living under that oppression. It transforms the whole thing into a very urgent end times scenario.
Wow, okay, so it takes historical text and projects it onto a future end-time screen using the specific interpretive key.
You could put it that way.
And here's where it gets really fascinating, again, speculative. The source tries to align this narrative with hypothetical news from today, September 16th, 2025.
Yeah, this is the correlation part of the analysis.
So starting with global polarization, how does that fit?
The source points to hypothetical tensions, maybe an emergency Arab-Islamic summit condemning Israel while the U.S. pledges full support.
Or say, U.S.-China friction over TikTok, NATO-Russia conflicts.
Yeah.
That kind of thing.
Exactly. These are presented as examples of the world being forced into that crisis of allegiance, having to choose sides, to stop halting between two opinions on a global scale.
Okay. Then what about the national level, that distress and subjugation idea?
Here, the source might correlate hypothetical U.S. news. Imagine the federal government sending the National Guard into Memphis against local wishes.
Okay.
Or maybe the U.S. and Europe still trading significantly with Russia despite sanctions. Or the U.S. moving towards a controversial TikTok deal with China.
How does that link to Nehemiah?
It's interpreted as mirroring that great distress and the feeling of external powers having dominion over our bodies, suggesting national sovereignty is being compromised by a larger global system.
Got it. And Jerusalem is central here too, right?
It's very central. The analysis points to hypothetical news like a major Israeli offensive in Gaza, maybe described as Gaza is burning.
Intense imagery.
Coupled with, say, UN condemnation, perhaps findings of genocide leading to Israel becoming more isolated internationally.
And this is seen as what?
As the literal manifestation of that great distress and international judgment spoken of in the prophetic narrative, Jerusalem becomes the absolute epicenter.
So you have this picture of intense conflict and judgment.
Exactly. And what the source finds striking is the contrast between that picture and the concurrent call from Matthew 5.44 to love your enemies.
A stark contrast indeed.
And it highlights the perceived need for that spirit of truth from John 16.13 to make sense of it all, to explain this rapid train of events and offer meaning when things seem chaotic.
So bringing this all together, what's a takeaway for you, the listener?
We've walked through a very specific analytical method.
Right. Seeing how one framework interprets ancient verses through a particular prophetic lens.
And then speculatively maps that onto a hypothetical snapshot of today's world.
The value isn't about whether the predictions are right, but about exploring how people try to make sense of complex, often overwhelming information. How different frameworks create narratives.
Finding patterns, seeking meaning in the chaos.
So maybe a final thought for you to consider. In a world that many do describe as being in great distress, what patterns or underlying narratives do you notice? And how might different ways of looking at things, different frameworks like this one, help us all try to discern meaning in fast-moving events?